My name is Andrew Selee. I'm the president of the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, in Washington, D.C. We've seen an enormous migration from Ukraine to Europe. That's been the biggest flow by far, especially to Poland, but then on to Germany and other countries in Europe. Ukrainians have visa-free travel, of course, to Europe, and the European Union decided to grant temporary protected status to Ukrainians for now, at this point, 3 years. Initially 1 year, but now it's been extended to 2 years and then 3 years. But we've also seen a quite large flow of Ukrainians to other countries, particularly Canada and the United States. And both Canada and the United States created special legal pathways for Ukrainians. And it's the subject of ongoing conversations, I would say, between countries in Europe and North America about how to respond to the Ukrainian displacement, how long to keep these measures in place, what to do at the end of when these measures run out of time. In the case of Europe, 3 years is supposed to be the maximum. There are some limits also in the case of the US and Canada. And so I would say there's very much ongoing communication among countries about how to deal with this. There's a strong sense of solidarity with the Ukrainians, a desire to keep options for them to leave the country if they need to, but at the same time an awareness that these cannot be indefinite measures. Sometimes it's hard to tell who's a refugee and who is someone who is a migrant seeking opportunities, and people have complex reasons for moving. And so increasingly, I think there's been a movement to think about alternate refugee pathways. I mean, both the traditional asylum systems, which are overburdened in most places. How do you get protection to people earlier? So maybe you can determine if someone is eligible for asylum or for refugee resettlement earlier on their journey before they try and get to Europe or the United States or another country of safe haven, and maybe save them the journey on the way, but also thinking about labor pathways and family reunification pathways as alternatives, because people may be displaced, they may be leaving their country because of circumstances beyond their control, but they might not quite fit in the definition of a refugee or an asylum seeker or asylee in the country where they arrive. And so thinking about those other pathways and how you can make sure that they're accessible to people who might need to leave is increasingly, I think, part of the conversation on both sides of the Atlantic. Most immigrants actually do really well in the countries that they arrive in, and they tend to arrive with some sort of built-in network, either a family or work. The challenges really are around irregular migration and around asylum seekers and around refugees who are resettled. And those are, particular to people who are coming from trauma, people who may not have networks where they go, people who may not have legal status, right, or have uncertain legal status. We see slightly different approaches and different outcomes on both sides of the Atlantic. The United States gives very little support to most immigrants and refugees, the exception of those refugees who are resettled, but even there it's somewhat bounded. On the other hand, the U.S. has, very flexible labor markets, and, immigrants actually have a higher rate of employment than the native born. It's a very flexible labor market, and there's a large informal market. So even people who may not have legal status tend to work at higher rates than native-born Americans. Europe labor markets are much more controlled. There are smaller, although they certainly exist, but smaller informal markets. But there's more state support, right? And so what you tend to see is that immigrants and refugees who are in more precarious circumstances get more support in Europe, but in the long term struggle more sometimes to become fully integrated in labor markets because of some of the barriers that exist. Also, in particularly in Northern Europe, societies that are quite high skilled, right, and labor markets that are quite high skilled. The U.S. does very little to help immigrants and refugees, with the exception of certain resettled refugees. But most manage to find their way in the labor market pretty quickly. It's hard to tell which is a better system. There is a rising number of people seeking asylum on both sides of the Atlantic. There's a need to rethink asylum systems to make them much more agile, to make decisions much quicker in a more efficient way and in fairer ways, as well as to figure out how you can give people protection who need it before they perhaps, get on a boat or take a long journey and arrive at a border. And so figuring out how to do protection earlier is actually something the US government has started, and there's a lot of interest in Europe in figuring out how to do this as well. There are, huge opportunities to think about ways of dealing with irregular migration, which I think, involves dealing with fixing asylum systems, but also building legal pathways as well as enforcing borders. It's sort of it's a triangle, if you want, with 3 points. You need to have asylum systems that work pretty efficiently. You need to have legal systems that allow people to move to fit into the labor market, the sectors of the labor market where there's a demand for jobs, and then you have to have enforcement of those pathways. And so I think there's some real learning that's going on. There's certainly conversations going on back and forth across the Atlantic. We have a group called the Transatlantic Council on Migration, where we actually try and bring people from governments on both sides of the Atlantic together periodically to have some of these conversations. And they're all incredibly rich and incredibly action oriented, because people are really taking ideas back and trying to put them into practice.